Hello, welcome back to Mrs. Torres' YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk about the discriminant. So the discriminant is a certain part of our quadratic formula. As you know, our quadratic formula is the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that over 2a. The discriminant is just the part under the square root, so just b squared minus 4 times a times c. We don't need the actual square root, it's just the number underneath the square root that we call the discriminant. Depending on what type of number the discriminant is, that tells us how many solutions we have and of what kind, whether they're real or imaginary. So there's three options. We could have a positive discriminant. If we have a positive discriminant, then our quadratic has two real solutions. So an example of that would be like 2 plus or minus the square root of 10, right? 10 would be our discriminant, therefore our two real answers would be 10, or 2 plus root 10 and 2 minus root 10. We could also have a negative discriminant. So that would be like 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 10. Well, since we have a negative under the square root, we know we're going to have an imaginary number there, right? So we have two imaginary solutions because it'd be 2 plus or minus I root 10. So it could either be a positive number, a negative number. Well, that seems like it covers it all, right? Well, we could also be 0, right? 0 is neither positive or negative. If you have a 0 discriminant, let's take a look at what that would look like. 2 plus or minus the square root of 0. So 0 is our discriminant. That means our answer is really just 2. But because it's a quadratic, we really have two solutions. We just have 2 twice. So we have one repeated solution. And I should say one real repeated solution. All right, so let's take a look at some examples. All right, the first one, let me get this lined up a little better here. Okay, so we have this quadratic here. So 5 is A, 6 is B, and 1 is C. We're not solving using the quadratic formula, so we don't need the whole formula. We just need the discriminant. So that's B squared minus 4 times A times C. Let's plug in our values. So we've got 6 squared. Remember, I just put this in parentheses because if it's a negative, we have to have it in parentheses or we'll get the wrong answer. So just get in the habit of using parentheses there. Minus 4 times A times C. Now, once we get to this point, you just have to type it in your calculator. If you want to, you can solve it. You can do this and then subtract the 2, or you can just type it in your calculator. So 6 squared minus 4 times 5 times 1. You just type it in exactly, hit enter, you'll get 16. So 16 is our discriminant. Now, what does that tell us about the type of solutions? That tells us, since it's positive, we have two real solutions. One thing that I forgot to say up here, every time we use the quadratic formula, whether it's solving using quadratic formula or just using the discriminant, our quadratic has to be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So to use any part of the quadratic formula, we have to have everything on one side and our equation equals 0. Luckily, our first one was already like that. But our second one, we're going to have to do some algebra before we find the discriminant. So we need everything on the left side of our equation. So we're going to add 4 to both sides. So we'll get 2x squared plus x plus 4 equals 0. Now that we've got everything on one side, we can find our a value, which is 2. Our b value, it looks like we just have x, but we can't forget there's really a 1 in front of there that we don't write. So b is 1, and then c is 4. Well, let's plug it into our discriminant. B squared is 1 squared minus 4 times a times c. At this point, we can just plug it into our calculator. So 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times 4, that's going to give us negative 31. And because our discriminant is negative, that means we have 2 imaginary solutions. All right, let's look at the last example, and then I just want to say one more thing, and this video is over. So we got to find the discriminant and figure out the type and how many solutions. Everything's got to be on one side. So let's subtract x squared from both sides. So negative x squared plus 2x minus 1 equals 0. Remember, we have that 1 there, so negative 1 for A, 2 for B, negative 1 for C. Remember, if you're subtracting a number, that's included when we decide what C is. So let's find the discriminant. 2 squared minus 4 times A times C. Make sure you have your negatives on A and on C there. All right, let's type it in. 2 squared minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 1. Look at that, we get 0. That means we have one real repeated solution. That is it for the discriminant. The last thing that I want to say is, let's say I give you the example 4x squared plus 6 equals 0. And I ask you, find the discriminant and tell me the types of solutions. So our a value is 4, right? Our b value, now, we might be tempted to say that this is our b value, but our b value has an x or whatever variable attached to it, right? Do we have an x term here? We don't, right? So think, what number would I multiply by b, or multiply by x, sorry, so it would kind of disappear? Well, that's going to be 0, right? So in this case, our b value is 0, and 6 is going to be our c value. So if you're missing a term, that coefficient is 0, or that a, b, or c is 0. So for example, if we had 4x squared plus x equals 0, here we're missing the c term, right? So a is 4, b is 1, and we don't have a constant. We're not adding anything on here, so c is going to be 0 there. All right, that's it for the discriminant. See you in the next video.